All right, Wonder Woman of the Dunes. So tonight I'm really excited to introduce everybody to Joe Grzalski. I've had the pleasure of working with Joe, I don't know how many years now, but he's one of my favorite rangers at the park. A seasonal that's been on and off, and working with a lot of partners in the area and the Learning Center in particular. So Joe will be telling us all about his research that he's been doing on these Wonder Women of the Dunes. And I will pass this to him here in a moment. I'm going to go over our, oh, why isn't this working? There we go. I want to go over our introductory items. So of course, always a thank you to the National Park Service and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative for helping to fund our virtual webinars. We also like to thank our partners for making this possible and providing the support for us to be able to secure our wonderful speakers and put the work in to be able to have everybody join us tonight. Quick Zoom basics. I know I think we're all pros by now, but during the presentation, please mute your microphone. We love to see your faces when we're talking, but feel free, you can keep your camera on or turn it off. Remember, you have the different views, whether you want to see speaker view or your gallery and see everybody's faces and feel like we're together. Put questions in the chat, questions, comments, anything. We love to have things come through the chat and type those questions in there. We can be sure to get to those. If not during the presentation, at the end, we'll have some Q&A. I don't think we're doing any polling tonight. You don't have any polls, do you, Joe? Nope. So no polling tonight. We don't have to worry about that. If anybody has any questions and they want to directly message myself or Heather, Heather, you can raise your hand. Heather's a good helper too with the Learning
I am
Center.
here. Sorry.
She's our Director of Marketing and Development. So you can message us if you have any specific questions that went in the background. And this is being recorded, and I think I hit the button for recording. Yes. So, and that will go out at a later date for you to visit again. What else? Is that it now? I get to pass this to Joe? I think so. So let me stop the share.
All right.
Oh, and at the end, oh, one more thing. And you have to stay at the end. We'll do our Wheel of Fortune at the end of this, but you have to be present to win. So that's my last thing. Joe, I'm going to pass this over to you. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Erin. Let me make sure and get my screen sharing here. All right. Loading. There we go. Do you guys see some women there?
We do.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of Wonder Women of the Dunes. My name is Joe Grzalski, and for the last 4 months or so, I've been diving into the incredible history of the women associated with our region. I'd like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement statement. If you're unfamiliar, land acknowledgement statements are an effort to respect, honor, and increase visibility of Indigenous peoples by recognizing that the land we're on traditionally belonged to them. This was produced for Indiana Dunes National Park. We acknowledge with great respect and gratitude that our park, Indiana Dunes, comprises some of the traditional lands of the Potawatomi and Miami peoples. In a similar spirit, I wanted to share this moment of reflection tonight. We acknowledge that our work of educating, sharing, and community building is built on the work of many others who came before us, and that many of those ancestors are women whose names have been lost, forgotten, or disregarded. So let us take a moment to recognize all the strong women, not just the ones we know about, who came before us and were stewards of this incredible place that we call the Dunes. The Indigenous women, the immigrants, the servants, the many teachers, mothers, sisters, and daughters. It's because of their commitment to place that we're here tonight. And this image here is just, it's like a postcard I found from Michigan City around 1905. And that's someone's sand sculpture. And I like the whole kind of look of it. I'm so excited that you guys decided to join me tonight and to celebrate Wonder Women of the Dunes, and also Happy Women's History Month. It's like kind of perfect timing, almost like it was planned. I've been working off a National Park Foundation grant that my previous supervisor, Kim Swift, successfully applied for. Kim had been leading programs on women of the dunes for a number of years, and many of you probably know that she recently moved to Colorado, where she is now the Chief of Interpretation at Rocky Mountain National Park. Myself and the whole dunes community could not be prouder of this exceptional educator, ranger, and friend. Kim was intent on the project's continuance, and so her departing gift was this grant. And it's also great to have Kim with us tonight. Kim. A little bit about myself. I'm 29 years old. I'm a graduate from the University of Illinois with a degree in geology. Aside from a couple years at the Museum of Science and Industry, the majority of my post-college life has been spent working at the dunes. The dunes have been my family's yearly vacation my entire life. So when I decided to pursue education with elements of the outdoors, the dunes were a perfect fit. I've been working on and off with the national park for about 5 years. It's been feeding my curiosity to continue learning. I love uncovering the past, and I find it very exciting. And I know how important understanding the past is for bettering the future. Some of my favorite things to learn about and discuss are forgotten stories. So uncovering these women and their stories has just been an absolute joy. After reading Janet Edwards' book on Diane of the Dunes, I was so interested and moved by her story, and I was shocked that not a lot of people knew about it. I kind of suggested that highlighting Diana at West Beach might be a good idea. Next thing I knew, I was researching and writing with Kim and Indiana Dunes Tourism for what became the Diana of the Dunes Dare. My parents and my partner, Zach, are also with us here tonight. I want to shout them all out for being my support. But since tonight is about remarkable women, I want to say a special shout out to my mom. My mom teaches me to be compassionate, loyal, hardworking, and fair. Above all, she's my hero and my inspiration to be the best I can be. I love you so much, Mom. My grant project requires me to produce about 10 biographies on the women. But once I began compiling a list of women that I wanted to focus on, I wasn't able to select just 10. I ended up picking about 14 women, but I in no way exhausted the number of wonder women of the dunes. I chose to select women who I thought were inextricably connected to the dunes and had some of the greatest impacts on the region or impressive achievements. My research took me to the depths of the internet, especially newspapers.com, to local libraries and museums, including Westchester. Big thank you to Serena from Westchester for helping me with my research. I also want to shout out Christy Gerlach for agreeing to supervise me through this endeavor, as well as the Dunes Learning Center for hosting me and my project and making this all possible. Something I noticed with my research was how all of the women I was researching were interconnected. Many of the women knew each other personally, and throughout my research, I found stories or events that connected all of the women in one way or another. So I got chills the first time I assembled this slide. This is a picture of the 14 women that I've been researching. And now, while many of their stories break the mold, similarities and patterns exist among the women. Many of these women could have been considered radical in their days, pushing boundaries, social boundaries of what women were considered acceptable to do. Determination, resilience, and deep ties to the Indiana Dunes echo in each woman. They each poured unwavering devotion through adversity towards a remarkable cause, and many simultaneously supported a family. All of them are incredible. And so, while tonight it'd be impossible to do all of these women justice, I felt conflicted in that I'd spent all this time uncovering all these stories and achievements to only be able to select a few to share with you tonight. And so, as a preview for the rest of the project, I want to go through each of the women pretty briefly to share some of their stories. And after I introduce all the women, I'm going to be focusing on 2 of them more in depth. I'm working with the park also to make brochures to highlight the women, and we're going to be getting their biographies that I'm producing onto the park's website. So stay tuned for the future of this project. And not that this is the most scientific analysis, but after I noticed the long lives of many of the women, I calculated their average age to be about 84. And so even though Alice Gray died young at 43, the majority of the women lived past their 80s. and over half of them live past their 90s. One of the women on my list is still with us, and that's Barbara Planten, and she still lives in the dunes at 93. So it seems that passion and the dunes are a recipe for a long life. All right, and so since there's no photograph of Marie Bailey, I kind of have a spread here of 5 of her daughters. And now Agatha there on the left was with a previous partner, but the 4 other daughters were with Joseph Bailey. Marie's life was full of changes. She was first raised in a small outpost west of Detroit called Frenchtown, the daughter of an Ottawa woman and a French trader. After the sudden death of her father, his family disowned her mother, her sister, and herself. They were left on the street, and Marie's mother brought them to live in an Ottawa village near Lake Michigan. Marie would eventually meet Joseph Bailey, start their family on Mackinac Island, and move to Indiana 200 years ago in 1822. She experienced the shifting control over the Northwest Territory and the detrimental effects of manifest destiny on Indigenous peoples. She resolutely oversaw the family and the homestead on the Little Calumet River and raised her children and grandchildren for more than 30 years after the death of her husband in an ever foreign world. I'm just amazed with Marie's resilience. We got Harriet Colfax, the determined Harriet Colfax. She grew up on the St. Lawrence River in New York, but she found herself really far upstream on the treacherous coast of Lake Michigan, because she moved to Michigan City when it was still really young back in 1853. For most of Harriet's life, for 43 years, she maintained the harbor beacon at the lighthouse as the lighthouse attendant. And she watched the frontier city bloom there to a Duneland metropolis and endured the ensuing hardships with her fellow companion Anne Hartwell. Drusilla Carr. Drusilla Carr was known in the newspapers as the Squatter Queen, and her story revolves around Miller Beach. And this is what I'm going to be sharing in a little more detail tonight. So I'm going to go to the next one here. We've got Flora Mae Richardson. She was a liberated woman and an early dunes preservationist. She settled in the coastal dunes north of Coles Bog with her husband William in 1910. For 50 years, she cultivated a passion for natural history, which she passed on through her last will, which created the Flora Richardson Foundation, saving her and her husband's Duneland treasure trove of books and photographs, and also protecting 100 acres of flatwoods in LaPorte County. And that picture there on the left is her in the winter. She's got an axe in her hand, but on the far left of that is a little structure that they would stay in called Sassafras Lodge. And actually, Alice Gray, or Diane of the Dunes, was known to stay in there a few times. Speaking of Alice Gray, or Diane of the Dunes, in 1915, her extraordinary life took a twist when she shunned conventional city living and made her home along Indiana's sandy shore. As Diane of the Dunes, she spent nearly a decade among the sands in makeshift lakeside shacks before her untimely death near today's West Beach. She sought solitude, advocated for dunes conservation, and left an internal imprint on the sands. These images of her I hadn't seen before until my research, and they're from a 1916 Chicago Tribune article. But I just love kind of the different view of her, and there she is on the beach near her shack, where she's got a little fire and a pot on it. Bess Vrooman Sheehan was an early staunch advocate for the first Save the Dunes movement of the 1910s, and she was a prominent, proactive clubwoman who felt a moral responsibility to transform society. She pivoted conservation pressure to the state, rallied women's clubs, and led the critically urgent campaign to the successful protection of Indiana Dunes State Park. Decades later, she relayed her past experiences with the second preservation push in the 1950s that would lead to Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. The image of her on the left there, the circular one, she's in the middle, smiling there, and on her left is Richard Lieber, the father of Indiana State Park System. And it's really hard to tell, but they're basically at the Prairie Club's house right on the top of the dune in today's state park. And I also, I've colorized a lot of old images to bring just a little more new life to them. So this one picture of Beth Sheehan was the only one I've ever seen in the middle. But in my research, I found a few others, and I was really happy to be able to colorize some of them. Dorothy Duel. She was inspired by women's success in conserving the state park and motivated by looming development and industrialization. She rallied public support and was instrumental in the battle to establish a national park in the dunes. With her enthusiasm, wit, and tireless energy, she established and directed the Save the Dunes Council, where she courageously led citizens insistent on stopping the despoiling of the remaining dunes. I really like that picture on the right there too. That was from another newspaper. Lois Howes. The keenly observant Lois Howes moved to Dune Acres in 1941, where she became deeply attuned with the natural areas around her on daily walks. As an avid naturalist and talented self-taught botanist, she convinced the Save the Dunes Council to make the pivotal purchase of Coles Bog back in 1953. She brought scientists and nature lovers on countless insightful forays around her home, and later alerted the park to ecological threats such as invasive cattail and fire suppression. She also made irreplaceable contributions to the park herbarium and rare plant monitoring system. A natural area known in the park known as Howes Prairie honors her legacy, and it's occasionally toured for special events like the Outdoor Adventure Fest. So keep an eye out for an opportunity to explore this one-of-a-kind place. Emma Bicky Pitcher. While living in the dunes near Tremont, Emma became renowned as a skilled educator who excelled at bridging the information gap between the National Park Science Division and an eager-to-learn public. She was a highly respected amateur naturalist who carefully studied the subtle intricacies of local habitats and enthusiastically relayed them through informative lectures, guided walks, and wonderfully engaging nature writing. She was a fantastic birder. She wrote that book there, Up and Down the Dunes, and she also helped teach many of the veteran interpreters at Indiana Dunes National Park. Kind and driven, Irene was born of Greek immigrants and raised in East Chicago, Indiana. She studied diligently and became a research chemist. Nature went from being a hobby to the perpetual forefront of her mind. By chance, a birding friend introduced her to something that she called the Griffith Dump. Irene was mesmerized at the place's beauty and couldn't believe that it was so close to her home. From 1967 to 1976, she personally led one of the state's most politically different preservation battles to save what many consider as Indiana's highest quality prairie remnant, today's Hoosier Prairie Nature Preserve. What began as just a 300-acre core area today protects savanna, prairie, and wetlands of like 1,500 acres. It's just beautiful, beautiful spot. This was in September. The colors there are just insane. Before her involvement with Save the Dunes, Sylvia Troy was known to be shy. The council helped metamorphose her into an indomitable defender, wielding newly learned strength and assertiveness on behalf of a cause. She was a resounding voice in securing the park's first expansion bill, and for nearly a decade, she passionately protected the dunes from further development and a barrage of threats while helping lead the Save the Dunes Council at a critical time in the park's infancy. She was also a founding member of Shirley Heinz Environmental Fund, today's Shirley Heinz Land Trust. Visionary Lee Botts grew up in the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma, but she was destined to be a chief defender of clean water and an inspiring environmentalist. After moving to Chicago in 1949, she marveled at the region's freshwater resources, and the Indiana Dunes quickly became a favorite family haunt. She joined efforts to save the unprotected dunes in 1959, seeing the creation of a park in 1966, and launching her lifelong career into environmental policy and education. She founded both the Alliance for the Great Lakes, the Dunes Learning Center, and was a leader in the campaign that made the Clean Water Act a reality. Both positive and fierce, Charlotte Reed was a reverent guardian of the public trust. who wholeheartedly committed herself to saving the dunes for over 6 decades, from trickling to cascading threats. I'm also going to be diving deeper into Charlotte's story tonight. And finally, we have the humble Barbara Planten, who was kind enough to let me interview her for this project. After retiring from English and moving to Dune Acres in 1988, Barbara had time for her passion of botany. She learned from both Lois Howes and Emma Pitcher, other Wonder Women, and she meticulously studied the dunes habitats and became a persistent advocate for natural land preservation and an expert botanist and mentor in her own right. Known as the preeminent plant detective in the region, for over 3 decades, she's lent her prowess in plant identification, has given countless engaging nature walks and workshops, and is an invaluable helping hand to park staff. She's also a life board member of Shirley Heinz Land Trust and has a preserve in Shirley Heinz that is named in her honor along the Little Calumet River. All right, and so Emily Taft Douglas, she isn't one of my Wonder Women per se, but I came across her in my research, and I just wanted to add a little bit about her, because while her husband is the known Douglas of the Dunes, Paul's wife, Emily, has an impressive history in her own right. She was a graduate of the University of Chicago, active in the League of Women Voters, and served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1944 to 1946. She was considered a specialist in foreign affairs. Her platform was rebuilding international peace, and she was a strong proponent of the formation of the United Nations. In 1966, the same year the National Lakeshore was established, she wrote a book entitled Remember the Ladies, the story of the women who helped shape America. She reflected on the paradigm shift concerning women's roles in society. She wrote, over the years, as a trickle of women wage earners swelled into a mighty stream, even men noticed that women had human as well as female needs. During the next decades, women gradually gained educational, economic, legal, and political rights that they had not known before. And while the majority of the women I researched lived at the cusp of this change or afterwards, a handful of them lived in dramatically different times. In 1881, Indiana legislators approved an amendment that would have given women the right to vote. But when the General Assembly reconvened in 1883, the amendment couldn't be found, they couldn't vote on it, and thus it failed. The Indiana legislature then enacted 3 separate laws that gave women the right to vote in 1917, but the Supreme Court of Indiana ruled that 2 of them were unconstitutional, and so hundreds of thousands of women's voter registration cards were thrown out. Women like Marie Bailey, Harriet Colfax, and Drusilla Carr navigated a world where many of the facets of politics and society treated women as second-class citizens. So one of the women I want to focus on tonight is Miss Drusilla Carr. And Drusilla was steeped in a very different time. Although she lived to see the conservation movement of natural spaces, she really represents the age where this kind of thinking was new. Drusilla Ben was born on July 29, 1856, at a small settlement on Salt Creek known as Gossett's Mill, which is northeast of Valparaiso in Porter County. Well, it doesn't exist today. But she and her brother became orphans in the 1860s, and she was taken in by a Miss Ann Thomas of Westchester Township. In 1870 census, she was listed as working as a domestic at the age of 13, and it was also noted that young Drusilla had never been taught to read or write. Her family's oral history remembers that at this time, Drusilla was forced to work around very hot ovens. Drusilla left the Thomas household in 1872 and moved to Lake County's lakefront near the mouth of the Grand Calumet River at Miller to work with her brother as a cook and housekeeper at John and Hank Granger's fishing shack. She was 15 at the time and recalled later that it was near Marquette Park, where Marquette Park is today, and close to the lagoon. At this time, the Grand Calumet River and the Little Calumet River were really just one river. They started in central Porter County. They headed west all the way to where you see that big arrow turn by Dolton. And after that 180-degree turn, It went all the way back to Gary or Miller, where it emptied into Lake Michigan. It seems that a change in hydrology, partially from canal building, allowed the flow to be lowered so much that eventually it closed up. And so if you're familiar with this view of Marquette Park, this is where the lagoon is today. But if you were to turn around from this spot and look across that little road, you'd notice there's this kind of linear wetland that extends all the way to the park's eastern side. So here's a view from the eastern side. And so kind of down under those trees is that long wetland. And that's really just the bed of the Grand Calumet River. It used to flow all the way there before making a quick turn going north right into the lake. And Drusilla would live in this immediate area for a number of years. The area that Drusilla moved to would be later described in court. The region was then a wilderness, consisting mainly of sand dunes and swamps. There were some ponds, drainage in the form of a broad and shallow river, and here and there clumps of scrub trees. Mink, muskrats, and skunks were plentiful. There were some raccoon, wolves, and fox. Wild rice and ducks were plentiful in season. A young man named Robert Carr, who grew up hunting and trapping with his father in Illinois, moved to the same place Drusilla would, but about 10 years earlier. Robert continued to hunt and trap while he lived there with his father. After Drusilla came, her and Robert's lives crossed near the beach, and soon the couple was engaged. They married on Christmas Day in 1875. Drusilla was 19 and Robert 27. Drusilla later explained her work and noted the consequence she observed from some unsustainable practices. She said, "I worked for Carolina Carr, my husband's stepmother. I picked cranberries for $1.25 a week. The hollows were filled with cranberries, and there were plenty of huckleberries. The man by the name of Nels Anderson, we called him Moss Anderson, pulled the moss out and shipped it to Detroit, I think to use in packing fruit trees. That is the reason there are no more cranberries here." So yeah, there used to be cranberries and sphagnum moss in a lot of the wetlands around Miller. After the birth and death of their first baby girl, the pair had a second child, Edward, in 1875. The little family lived near the beach, and it was dotted with fishermen's shacks and trappers' shacks. Drusilla remembered, "I always helped do the fishing. When my oldest son was a baby, I took him with me and rolled him up in a blanket and laid him on the beach. As we moved our windlasses closer together, I moved the baby accordingly." Windlasses were basically these pulleys that were affixed to the beach where they could bring in their nets. The next year, a man would visit the Carrs. Drusilla spoke of this early history of the property later in court. She said, "In March 1976, a man came who said his name was Bingham. He said that in the East he had traded for some land in Section 31, and he wanted Mr. Carr to help him locate it. My husband went with him in a boat across the river to the lake. They returned in the evening, and Bingham stayed overnight. He said he was discouraged with his land, that he had been buncoed, and it's not worth the cost of recording a deed. I said, 'If you don't want it, give it to me.' He answered, 'Mrs. Carr, if you will move on the land, you may have it.'" So in order to get a notary to make it all official, they would have had to gone to Hobart, but they had no horses and only an ox team, which couldn't make the journey. And so what they did was Bingham made a copy of the deed to take for himself and promised to get it notarized and sent back to Drusilla. He left there on the third evening. Drusilla continued, "I never saw him after that. I received a letter from him stating that he had lost his copy and asking me to send him the deed. I sent him the deed and never heard from him afterward. I wrote him once after that, but received no reply. I remember what was in that deed. It read, 'We now convey to Bingham all the land in Section 31, laying between Lake Michigan and the Grand Calumet River, and west of its mouth to the section line west.'" And so these are the boundaries that Drusilla would find herself having to defend, roughly 200 acres. And so from that satellite image there, you can see the big swath of the Marquette lagoons. And you can even see the grassy area where the river would have continued. And so she basically claimed to own all of the land north of there and basically all the way west about as far as you can see here in this view. For a decade or so, they lived at the mouth of the Grand Calumet River, occupying a cabin that had been previously built. In 1877, Drusilla gave birth to another daughter who died shortly after. The Carrs collected loads of kindling, cordwood, and lumber from the beach where that had drifted in during storms. They also picked the wild sand cherries and grapes for their own use, and they gathered and sold sassafras in the spring. Though they supplemented by gathering, fishing was likely the family's main source of income. The Carrs sold their catch at nearby Clark Station and other small settlements near the shore westward towards Chicago. Drusilla would later testify to at times to having to drive trappers off while asserting, "This is our land." While living in the cabin on the river, Drusilla and Robert's family continued to grow. Drusilla gave birth to her daughter, Clara. 3 years later, in 1881, a new baby boy, Frederick. In 1883, another son, Henry. And in 1886, another girl, Annetta. This photo is from around 1893, so a few years after that, when their youngest daughter was born. And so Drusilla is seated there kind of in the middle right, and that's her husband there, of course, in the middle left. The Carrs owned a house in Miller, the small nearby settlement, and Drusilla would go to live there in September when the children would start going to school and stay there until the term closed. Miller was a very small community at this time. It was a settlement that had formed along the railroad stop there that had come through around 1851, 1852. It would gain a post office in 1865 and a schoolhouse in the 1870s. The main commerce of the area was selling ice, fish, and sand. And so the picture on the left there is the schoolhouse from the 1880, and it was replaced with the one on the right in 1890. And both of those were at the site of Miller's historic 1910 schoolhouse today. And so that's where the Carr children would have been attending school. Calumet River's mouth at Lake Michigan became entirely closed in by sand by the 1880s. Around this time, the family of 8 moved from their cabin near the river's old mouth to another cabin down the shore. Drusilla said, "We moved out onto the beach, north and west. We decided we would go to the lakefront where it would be handier to my husband's business. He was engaged in fishing." The area they moved to is today's Lake Street Beach parking lot. The early road you see in this picture here is Lake Street, but this image is from a little bit later when the Carrs allowed cottages to be built on their land. The family fished the lake and filled their ice house with ice that they had cut from the nearby river. In 1890, Drusilla gave birth to their 8th and last child, Myrtle. She recounted one frightful occasion with a bald eagle and one of her babies on the beach. She said, "Once I was attacked by one and had a terrible time with it. When I went down to the beach, it tried to get at my baby. The eagle was terrible hungry, and I fought it for quite a while. My sunbonnet seemed to keep it away from my head and eyes, but I had to fight it hard to keep it away, and it might have gotten the baby if it had not been for the bonnet." So I just imagine trying to keep off a bald eagle from your baby with a sunbonnet on the beach. Sounds like a crazy scene. So the road, Lake Street, was laid as gravel in 1896, and a bridge was built over the Grand Calumet River. So this is, if you drive on Lake Street today, headed right to Lake Street Beach, this is the bridge over the river. Not the same bridge, of course. And at this time, the Carr family put rollers under their house and just moved it to the other side of the street for whatever reason. But after the construction of this bridge, it allowed for the Carr children to go directly to school from this beach house. So this kind of became more the permanent residence. And if you see the dune there on the right, that is Chanute Hill. And it's still there today, but it's a little bit of a sand mined reduction of what it used to be. So it's called Chanute Hill because of Octave Chanute. So around this time, 1896, Drusilla actually befriended Octave Chanute, considered the grandfather of flight, who used the Carr's property for his glider experiments. In June of 1896, Octave and his team left the station at Miller with their equipment and headed for the sand. Drusilla let them use her beach and dunes, where for 2 weeks the camp would construct, adjust, and test gliders. The area was perfect for those kinds of experiments because there's, of course, a lot of wind and a lot of sand that you'd need for soft landings. Drusilla was known to defend Octave from townspeople who called him the crazy old man of the sand dunes and spread rumors that his gliders that he was using were thatched with chicken feathers. Despite her efforts, though, to defend him, Octave chose a more secluded spot for his second test of glider experiments in the dunes. While their eldest son, Edward, took care of fishing operations at the Miller Lakefront, Drusilla, Robert, and the other family moved to Indiana Harbor in 1902. While it's unclear why they moved here, that community had just been established the year prior, and the area had a lot of industrial development, including Inland Steel and Standard Oil's refinery. Today, the area is a part of East Chicago. The tragedy struck shortly after the family's move. Drusilla's husband, Robert, died there that December. Drusilla returned to the Miller Lakefront about a year later in February of 1904. But industrial expansion was continuing to accelerate in the Calumet region. In 1906, Drusilla witnessed the further occupation of the lakeshore with the building of Gary, known as the Magic City because of its quick construction from an area considered wasteland. Workers drove teams of horses and mules to plow through the sandhills and the wetlands, creating buildable land by smoothing the land's beach ridges into their adjacent lowlands. This is Drusilla's house there on the beach. So the beginning of Drusilla's legal proceedings are interesting. In 1903, her husband and a Rosella Carr were part of a lawsuit by the Hitt family. But Drusilla's husband had died in 1902, and she was being sued in her wrong name. It's unclear of what Drusilla knew of the matter, but she failed to appear in court, and by 1907, judgment defaulted against her. That July, the Carrs would grieve again with the death of Drusilla's youngest, Myrtle, who died at 16. A year later, in 1908, the 52-year-old widow entered the courts on her own accord. She decided to sue the Hitts to quiet the title of her land. For the past 30 years, the Carrs' claim remained unquestioned, but with an increasing population and available land along Lake Michigan disappearing, the property became much desired. In February of 1911, Drusilla's 1908 case was dismissed. That same day, she filed another suit in Lake County Superior Court that she won the following May. After an appeal and countless delays, the case went to the appellate court, and in June of 1915, the jury again found Drusilla to be the owner of roughly 150 acres on the grounds of continued possession for more than 20 years, known as squatters' rights. Though she had won this particular case with the Hitts, they remained in the courts for over 10 years after this. While Drusilla's case was in the courts, the city of Gary began legal action to acquire lakefront property for a park. In 1910, the mayor thought that he had the authority to condemn parkland along Miller's lakefront because it was within the set distance from Gary, but he missed the stipulation that couldn't be done if land was already part of a town. Well, Miller had just incorporated into a town a few years earlier, and so the premature condemnation was blocked, and a newspaper at the time highlighted Gary's path forward. The annexation of Miller would be necessary before the land could be condemned. But that same article notes that approximately 75% of the owners of property in Miller were against annexation. In 1912, the Munster Times wrote, "It is now practically decided that Gary will get no lakefront park. While many Miller people would like to see a public park in town, there is too much suspicion of the Gary City Hall crowd. The political history of Gary is too well known in Miller, and for that reason, there is no disposition to place the lakefront in the hands of the present administration." But Gary's 7-mile lakefront was occupied by industry, and city officials were set on providing a lakefront park. The city decided to pursue annexation of Miller to get the land. Beginning in 1908, the South Shore Line began passenger service to the dunes, including Miller, which led to its growth as a summer resort. An article from 1911 helps illustrate the growing interest in the lakefront. In summer, Miller Beach is the mecca for thousands from Chicago and from towns and cities of northern Indiana. In the last few years, the town has become the Atlantic City of Indiana, only lacking the amusement attractions of the Eastern Ocean Resort. Well, that same year, Drusilla opened up a bathhouse on the beach. Each morning, she raised an American flag to the top of its mast. Her bathing beach was exceedingly popular. One Sunday in 1914, around 3,000 people were said to have visited. The Carrs charged for dressing rooms and for bathing suit rentals. The beach had a miniature railroad, a shooting gallery, a pleasure boat, and several night spots. Drusilla would also cook and sell fish dinners to the beachgoers. Following her courtroom victory in 1915, she filed another case to quiet the title of around 60 more acres. 5 weeks later, the jury decided in the Superior Court of Michigan City that Drusilla was the rightful owner through squatters' rights. But with appeal after appeal, litigation continued on this case and the Hitt case for years after. By 1917, Drusilla's son Fred managed the dance hall and roller rink, and there were over 100 cottages on the beach that they collected rent from. That same year, Eli Stillman Bailey wrote in his book, The Sand Dunes of Indiana, "At Carr's, 1,000 visitors have enjoyed the bathing, not only one day, but on several occasions, and 10,000 people have taken advantage of a national holiday to visit this beach." So it was really the spot to be around the turn of the century and the 1910s. This is a picture of just an idea of one of those beach cottages. And so it wouldn't have been a year-round thing, but just a little spot to spend for the summer. And then this was an article on Carr's Beach and had these women playing in the water. The caption said, "A couple of water nymphs at Carr's Beach, Miller, Indiana, who prefer to play in the water than explore the sand dunes." The push for Gary to annex Miller continued. Another article stated, "The imposition of high taxes and heavy assessments deter Miller people from annexation step at this time." A newspaper in 1916 shared some insight into the situation involving Drusilla. It said, "The Gary Park commissioners had been constantly besieging the feeble old woman. They have set out to condemn the land ostensibly for park purposes and are now restrained by court order. Steel men dominate the park board. Corporation lawyers and hired orators are trying to induce the town of Miller to be annexed to Gary so that the park board can more readily condemn the land. 2 of the papers at Gary are annoying the 70-year-old woman and are believed to be trying to intimidate the people of Miller into consenting to annexation by printing stories that if the park board doesn't get the land, shady resorts will be started, presumably on the land in question, by one of her lawyers." So suspicions involving Gary's administration at the time contributed to the public's hesitancy of both annexation and a lakefront park. Some actually feared that it would only be accessible to the affluent. But in 1919, the city of Gary successfully, albeit controversially, acquired the town of Miller through annexation. William P. Gleason, the superintendent of Gary Works, donated 116 acres of lakefront on behalf of the company. It was first called Lakefront Park, and when expanded later, Marquette Park. And so this land was a part of Drusilla's original tract, but she decided to sell these acres instead of trying to fight condemnation. Although Carr's Beach still provided revenue for her, it wasn't enough to cover the seemingly endless lawyer and court fees. So as the years went on, Drusilla had to sell tracts of her land to pay for her court battles against other citizens, U.S. Steel, and their associates. It's important to note that the establishment of a lakefront park was progressive at the time, though. Marquette Park was only the second park, second to Michigan City's Washington Park, as kind of the earliest portion, really, of the dunes preserved. But the more accessible city park with amenities did definitely put a squeeze on Carr's Beach and the income she made there. That's Drusilla on the far left. Very, very few, of course, photos of Drusilla being born in the 1850s, but I grabbed what I could. An attorney for her called her a forceful, determined woman with a lot of grit. Although unschooled, knew her rights and would not be pushed around. In 1920, her son Edward died at age 45. That same year, Drusilla concisely summarized her legal claim to the papers. No one ever told me I was on their property. If living on the property and developing it doesn't give a person the right to possession, I would like to know why. After having lived on my property for 31 years, I brought suit to quiet title, and since that time, for 15 years, while I grew older all of the time, the case has been in the courts. The article accompanying her statement said Drusilla would like to sell the remainder of her property to a syndicate able to build a hotel and preserve the place as the finest example of native beach along Lake Michigan. Throughout her many court cases, Mrs. Carr would occasionally be ordered off the land, but she ignored all evacuation notices. She had beautiful blooming gardens, and it was common for visitors to leave her a donation or $1 for a flower. Many neighbors would visit to check on her during the cold winters. She was sometimes referred to as the squatter queen or fisher woman. She disliked publicity and was known to shake a broom at reporters. While the eastern part of her original tract had been made into a city park, the western portion of it was at risk to industrial expansion. In January of 1923, Drusilla won her third victory against the Hits, quieting 88 acres of her land for the time being. That March, Drusilla said, "I hope the scenes of my youth, where I have lived so happily and brought up my children, will not be desecrated by huge industrial smokestacks. I would rather sell to people willing to make this a beauty spot, a wonderful beach, but sell I will." In October 1929, storm waves destroyed Carr's Beach's roller skating rink, concession stand, and their shooting gallery concession. Drusilla continued to finance her legal battles through selling off pieces of her holdings. Between 1912 and 1917, her lawyer, Frank Patty, paid delinquent taxes on a piece of her estate and sold it to the Gary Land Company. This would remain a part of her final court case. Quote, "Attorneys from Mrs. Carr based their defense on the alleged promise made to Mrs. Carr by attorney Patty, in which he had agreed to return title on the land to her after the taxes, interest, and fees had been paid to him. In 1927, Indiana passed a law that required squatters to pay property taxes, including back taxes. Though Drusilla offered to assume the debt, U.S. Steel refused and continued litigation. An article from April 25, 1930 illustrates a courtroom scene. A veteran of 12 hard-fought court battles, 8 of which she emerged from victorious, Mrs. Carr took the seat, shook out her skirts, and faced the courtroom squarely. On her left were arrayed the Gary Land Company's counsel. In the spectator's pew sat a lone figure, Fred Carr, her eldest son. Her wrinkled countenance lightened up a faint smile when she espied him. While the old woman was testifying, Fred Crumpacker, Hammond lawyer, representing the land company, objected frequently and vigorously to certain questions put by Darrow. However, he was overruled almost invariably by Judge Chipman, who appeared anxious to hear all of the aged squatter's story. In his cross-examination of the witness, Crumpacker attempted to prove that the disputed tract was really best suited for a manufacturing site, and that the 200-odd cottages now on it were mere shacks. Once during the cross-examination, Crumpacker, sensing that the old woman was becoming fatigued, asked her if she were too tired to go on. She straightened in her chair as if from an electric shock. "Me? Tired?" she exclaimed. "I should say not, young fellow. You go right ahead." That August, the Munster Times wrote of the judge's anticipated ruling, that she was in undisputed possession of the Miller Beach tract, and that the tax sales and deeds by her old lawyer were illegal and invalid. But Drusilla's health was failing. On September 15, 1930, near the hour of her death, she revealed she had an important message to deliver and summoned her lawyers. But before their arrival, she died. At her autumnal funeral at Top Miller Cemetery, Frederick Backmeyer spoke to several hundred mourners, saying, "She was a heroic little soul who stood her ground when she thought she was in the right. Strength, courage, and dignity were her clothing." The next January, the judge indeed ruled in her estate's favor, but also mandated that the Carrs had to pay back taxes plus interest to properly own the land. In November of 1937, Drusilla's heirs' corporation that oversaw the estate tried to sell half of their 88-acre tract that was next to Marquette Park with the back taxes for $120,000 to Gary for park purposes. Despite the property being worth millions and the back taxes only about $40,000, the city declined. Moles in the Carrs' corporation for U.S. Steel had reported what was brewing, and so the company hinted that it would donate a comparable chunk of land to the city for free. A few years later, in 1940, the compounded debt on the whole tract had accumulated to $92,000. Without payment from the Carrs Corporation, the land was set to be auctioned. Just before it went up for auction, it was sold to a land company owned by U.S. Steel at a sheriff's sale. A Valparaiso newspaper reported, in defiance of a restraining order served 1 minute before he was scheduled to offer the Drusilla Carr tract of land for sale to the highest bidder, Sheriff John Knotts sold the property to Gary Land Company for $92,600. The land sat unused for about a decade before U.S. Steel decided against expansion and sold the former Carr land to Gary for about what it had paid. By 1958, Marquette Park expanded westward to contain the Lake Street Beach area today. U.S. Steel still held, though, a large tract south and west of there for expansion. In 1961, the battle between preserving the dunes for a national park and for using the land for a port for industry was raging. The major push for its construction was in Porter County, but Mayor George Chicharis of Gary and other Lake County mayors wanted the port built in their county. The city of Gary even filed a case in federal court to prevent Midwest Steel, near today's Porter's Lakefront Riverwalk, from building their break wall there. But the port was eventually realized in Porter County at an expensive area known as the Central Dunes. If the port had been approved for Lake County, though, much of the land there would be, of course, unrecognizable today. As the years passed, the old Carr tract of land west of Lake Street Beach and the adjacent vast U.S. Steel holding remained undeveloped for the most part. By 1976, an Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore expansion bill being considered by Congress included that former Carr tract. Around that time, Gary spoke with the steel company about a donation of their holding to the city. Now Gary was proposing to build a marina on Lake Michigan similar to Hammond's using this land. But before any donation of the land could occur, the park bill passed, and Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore expanded to include what is known as today the Miller Woods, which comprises both the Carr tract and the land that U.S. Steel had held for expansion. An unspoiled roughly 300 acres of beach, lagoons, dunes, black oak savanna. A portion of Drusilla's land had been successfully added to the national park to remain open space. Today, Marquette Park or Miller Woods in Gary are wonderful places to connect to Drusilla's story. The Paul H. Douglas Trail in Miller winds through the beach ridges and wetlands that were once under the threat of development. Drusilla's original tract begins on the trail when you cross the Grand Calumet River, where over a century ago, her and her family were cutting out blocks of ice to keep them for the summer. Of course, extended all the way to the beach, all the way east to where the mouth of the river came out, and west to the section line, which is quite a ways west. All right. So that's Drusilla Carr. And I have these pictures now, a spread of 3 different pictures of some beach scenes from Waverly Beach. And I had used them in a previous presentation with the League of Women Voters just to kind of show some fun random women scenes in the dunes. But in my research, I have to find a newspaper article that seemed to tie with this kind of idea really well. And so I wanted to share that. It's from 1921 from the Munster Times. It says, reporters shocked at bath garb. What constitutes a fair standard of modesty in a young woman's bathing costume? The dowagers who watch the passing show from the screened porches of the cottages at Waverly Beach are debating the question of censorship. It is proposed to establish rules and regulations covering girls' bathing suits, and to patrol the beach at night. The costumes are scantier this year than ever before, the dowagers declare. The one-piece bathing suit with V-shaped back is much in evidence. Co-eds from Chicago schools have been making weekend sojourns in the dunes, and it is said that they don their athletic bathing suits Friday evening and wear them until Monday morning. The bachelor girls have rented cottages. My goodness, one of the co-eds exclaimed when told of the proposed censorship. Is it possible that they expect a girl to wear a skirted bathing suit and things in this day and age? We come to the dunes to be away from the crowded beaches and the fashionable resorts. We are living by ourselves nearly a mile away from the regular bathing place, and I can't for the life of me understand how anyone could be so narrow-minded as to criticize us for wearing one-piece suits. It is so difficult to swim in any other kind. All this talk is prompted by jealousy. The self-appointed censors are said to have served notice on the bathhouse proprietors that all suits must have a skirt extending at least a third of the way down to the knees, and that they must not be cut so low under the arms. Spooning on the beach at night is also objectionable. On hot nights, it is claimed, the spooners are in evidence long after midnight, sometimes as late as 2 o'clock in the morning. I thought that was just kind of an interesting look into 1920. Yeah, the scandal, right? The scandal. So while other women I researched had roles for the first push of the national park or for the state parks formation or the national lake shores, I wanted to talk about Charlotte tonight, whose story is connected to all of those time periods. I also love how Charlotte is connected to so many of the other women I researched. While I'll touch on her involvement in the push for a national lakeshore, what I'm really excited to highlight tonight are the decades after the park was established, where Charlotte continued to display her unyielding commitment to duty, which to her was perpetually saving the dunes. And so I also want to note that although I'm focusing on Charlotte tonight, her and her husband Herb were a dream team and both instrumental in protecting the dunes. Charlotte was born in Chicago on March 27th, 1929, the only child of Swedish immigrants Charles and Tekla Johnson. Charles owned a thriving construction business until the stock market crash of that year. He is listed as a painter in the 1940 census, but died a few years later when Charlotte was just 16. She said in an interview, "I grew up near Jackson Park. The lake was our playground. I can't imagine growing up without that." Charlotte could leave her home and within a few minutes be at Lake Michigan's shore. Her mother supported them by working as a beautician. Charlotte attended the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and graduated in 1950 with a degree in economics. One night in September of 1951, Charlotte met Herbert Reed at a social function back home for singles. Although they had never met, they grew up nearby one another, and Herb had graduated from the same university with a degree in architecture just a couple years earlier. After the pair had ice cream together and went on a second date to the stock car races, Herb took Charlotte to the dunes. 2 years later, on September 6, 1952, she married Herb. Charlotte would later recall, "I was married into the Indiana dunes." That same year, Herb designed a home for his parents, Philo and Irene, who were early Prairie Club members. The home's limestone landscaping makes a fitting nod to Jens Jensen's prairie style. In fact, it was Jens Jensen who ran into Philo on the beach in the early 1900s, and their conversation brought the Reeds to joining the Prairie Club and the whole first preservation movement of the dunes. The home that Herb designed for his parents was constructed in an area that's kind of near today's Glenwood Dunes. Philo was acquainted with Dorothy Buell and became familiar with the Save the Dunes efforts, and he and Irene got Herb and Charlotte to join the cause. The newlyweds wrote their first non-rent check together for Save the Dunes Council's first fall dinner in 1952. Later, they would agree that they had no idea the amount of energy and time that would be required, but once they began, they just couldn't stop. In 1958, Porter County's chapter of the Isaac Walton League was founded in this house by Irene, Philo, Charlotte, and Herb. Countless meetings were held in this Glenwood Dunes area home. The chapter would become and remain a conservation leader in the region. In fact, Charlotte and Herb celebrated the group's 60th anniversary in 2018. Representative Pete Grzalski attended the anniversary to present the chapter with a certification for a continuing resolution, which had been read into the congressional record that recognized the chapter for its contributions to conservation. He told the gathering, "This chapter helped create that park. It's one of the greatest assets we have in Northwest Indiana." The next year, in 1959, the couple moved to Indiana to live near the dunes and to raise their family. Charlotte recalled that they had 2 sons, John and Jim, a third, David, on the way, and they decided it was time to move out of the city to raise the kids. The family had made a point to visit the state park at least once a week. Herb proudly said in an interview once that their kids know every inch of the state park. The Reeds would have 2 more children, Susie and Bill, and the family would spend decades in that house before the land was returned to the National Lakeshore. Charlotte spoke of the early years of the Save the Dunes Council. I think that probably a lot of the council members thought that by getting out the message that the dunes were beautiful, there are all these birds and all these flowers, it would make its own case. You didn't have to get partisan or political. They were just so beautiful that once you made the facts known, the numbers would flock. But it's not the kind of lobbying or political involvement we thought we could do. The group was beginning to transform. In their book, The Land Speaks, Debbie Lee and Catherine Newfont wrote of this moment of change in Save the Dunes. The previously non-political group made a very politically charged move. It shifted its focus from raising funds to buy land for donation to the state park to more direct efforts that challenged the creation of a port and proposed the establishment of a national lakeshore. Herb and his Save the Dunes engineering committee became instrumental in stalling the port's approval. 3 different times, Herb and his committee successfully challenged cost-benefit ratios that were listed in the Army Corps' reports, which required them to redraw the plans each time. This required a lot of traveling between Porter County and Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, Charlotte continued the fight on the home front while raising her children. Their son David recalled in an interview with the Chicago Tribune, "My mom and dad obviously have been well known our entire lives, and for all these efforts, they have a celebrated public persona. But there are things people don't know, like what a wonderful mother she was to all of us." The article continued, "A mother who made Jell-O mold in the shape of a 5-pointed star so that each of her children got a piece, who often had one of her children, long before they were old enough to do so, legally grab the wheel and steer one of her vintage cars. She made Swedish pancakes and other treats, read classic literature to her children at bedtime." David also added that his mother demanded to sit in on all of her children's classes to see what they were being taught. From 1962 to 1963, Charlotte and Herb heard the hum of machinery leveling the area known as the Central Dunes. They heard it from their bedroom window. It was the principal tract of land that the council was fighting to save, but also the one that industry was set on. Despite the loss of this area, the group doubled down and continued to fight to save the remaining pieces of duneland habitat. In fall of 1966, Charlotte went to Washington, D.C. with other Save the Dunes members on her first lobbying trip. The group visited all 435 congressional offices to plead their case, and they were rewarded. Because following the 14-year effort led by Dorothy Buell and the council, October 14, 1966, Congress finally authorized an Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. Charlotte remembered the unbelievable victory. "When the bill passed, we had a euphoric moment," she said. Many in the council believed that this meant the work was over. Charlotte recalled, "Everyone thought we could go home." She would later reflect on the success of the bill's passing. Talk about babes in the woods. Although the park was authorized, it would not exist unless funds were also authorized for acquisition. Charlotte and several other Save the Dunes members traveled back to Washington, D.C. to demand funding for the newly designated park. Charlotte had a natural gift for diplomacy, the ability to sense another person's character and values, to understand where it was possible to find common ground. When Senator Douglas lost his bid for re-election in 1966, the park lost its major federal proponent, making the effort to secure funding that much more difficult. But in April of 1968, Congress succumbed to the massive coordinated lobbying efforts by the council and allotted $2 million in emergency funds for acquisition. This is a photo of Charlotte and Sylvia presenting the regional director of the National Park Service with the Save the Dunes Award some years later. According to the park's administrative history, funding for West Beach development became a reality in 1971 after Congressman Roush came to the dunes and met with Superintendent Whitehouse, Charlotte, Herb, and Sylvia. After their meeting, the superintendent's original $1.2 million request grew to $2.1 million funded. Charlotte was a conservationist who contended that communication between park planning and local groups left some room for improvement in the early years of relations. In 1971, the National Park Service unveiled their plans for development of West Beach. The council, led by Sylvia Troy, had to travel to Indianapolis to find out what the plans were. An hour before daybreak, Sylvia met with Charlotte and Herb to begin their trip. Up until then, the plans had remained closely guarded with no public input, so they didn't really know what to expect. They were left in shock as the plans were unveiled. Quote, 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools, 2 steel bathhouses, a 3-story parking garage, a pavilion, a sports fields, winter coasting slopes, a man-made dune, an amphitheater, an ice skating rink, basketball courts, a viewing terrace over the swimming pools, a field game area, a boating lagoon, a fishing lagoon, 5 day-use shelters, storage and maintenance facilities, an administration building, and 16 residential units for NPS employees. Suffice to say, they were blindsided. After the short meeting ended, the conservationists went closer up to view the plans. After saying the plans were not public, though, the officials quickly gathered the documents and left. Charlotte shook her head and quipped, "They act like they're handling CIA documents." After the trio's gloomy lunch together, Charlotte said, "This is too dangerous to believe. We'll change those plans." They protested to the newspapers, to their congressional supporters, and to the Secretary of the Interior. As a result, a planning advisory group that incorporated local and regional planning agencies, as well as area citizens groups, was created. And a new, more acceptable general management plan for West Beach development eventually emerged. A few years later, the Park Service mandated that local public hearings on general management plans be required throughout the National Park Service system-wide. In 1972, Charlotte became president for Porter County's Isaac Walton League, and she would also continue to lead that chapter until 1976. In 1973, she became a seasonal interpretive ranger for Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, a position she held again in 1974. Part of her job included collecting data from old photographs in order to help provide a blueprint for the park's initial restoration of the Bailey Homestead. Charlotte would later say, "I realized that my heart lay in being a citizen watchdog and not part of the bureaucracy." That same year, Charlotte became the first paid employee of Save the Dunes when she took on the role of executive director, a role that she held from 1974 to 1992. Following years of attempts and failures, Charlotte spoke to a reporter about the council's efforts to secure a park expansion bill. Acre for acre, there has been more struggle over the Indiana Dunes than anywhere else. With every year this doesn't get passed, more land is destroyed or developed. If it doesn't pass this year, the pressure for development will build. A few weeks later, the 1976 expansion bill passed, adding 3,700 acres to the park. Although the park expanded, the council was unsuccessful in adding the Greenbelt property, a corridor of man-made ponds and buffer land that exists between Coles Bog and its industrial neighbors. The council's senses were heightened to the importance of buffer areas after it was discovered that Indiana's toll road's salt pile was bleeding into the National Lakeshore's Pinhook Bog wetland. The Greenbelt area posed a serious risk of coal ash seepage contamination to Coles Bog, something that Charlotte and the council alerted officials to after they had witnessed accelerated dumping in the area in 1973, but at this time, this type of unlined disposal was legal. After the success of their first lakeshore expansion, Save the Dunes Council continued to fight to include additional parcels. The council was trying to absorb areas that had been part of Paul Douglas's original bill for a national park unit. Charlotte and the council again promoted the acquisition of the Greenbelt area in another expansion bill in 1979. Charlotte felt that control of the property was essential to ensure the ecological integrity of Coles Bog. The council was dismayed when the controversial Greenbelt track was eventually dropped from the successful expansion bill of 1980. Although it was never officially added to the park, the most recent expansion bill from 1992 stipulated that the property owner is required to maintain the natural state of the land and must notify Congress 3 years prior to changing the character of the property. So although it was never added, thousands of other acres were added to the park through 4 expansion bills, all occurring through Charlotte's time as executive director with Save the Dunes. Charlotte would later say that some of her most memorable moments were with the council was every time a Dunes expansion bill was passed and signed by the president, quote, because it was always a struggle. Today, an area of the Greenbelt property is part of a planned massive EPA cleanup to remove coal ash deposits to protect Coles Bog from pollution potential. Over 100,000 cubic yards of dry coal ash and dirt will be removed, and another 85,000 cubic yards of contamination below the water level will be contained in place. In 1981, the Shirley Heinz Environmental Fund, today's Shirley Heinz Land Trust, was established by an endowment of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Seidner on behalf of their friend who had recently passed away. Dr. Shirley Heinz was devoted to nature study in her free time and participated in the fight to save the Indiana Dunes. Charlotte became the group's first executive director. Their mission is to preserve and restore natural lands and waters in Northwest Indiana and to engage people in nature and conservation. Charlotte was involved in the early Nature Conservancy donations of great marsh properties in Beverly Shores. Today, the group protects over 2,600 acres in the region. Charlotte recalled, I started out just wanting to preserve the beautiful dunes, but I realized that I couldn't ignore the air and water pollution and other factors that affected the dunes. In August of 1970, the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, NIPSCO, had filed an application for a permit to construct a nuclear plant next to its fossil fuel generating facility at Burns Harbor. The most active group that opposed the facility, known as Bailey 1, was the Porter County chapter of the Isaac Walton League, led by Herb and Charlotte. They, along with Sylvia Troy and Edward Osen of Save the Dunes, were instrumental in halting the plant's construction. Quote, there was little the park could do except monitor the activity and express its opinion. Charlotte said of the project, the company knew when they picked that site, it was like waving a red flag in front of environmentalists. Countless court battles ensued, but the Save the Dunes Council didn't become involved in any until around 1980. Charlotte commented on the lack of an evacuation plan for visitors to the park. Quote, it's ludicrous to say we'll worry about evacuation when the plant is built. The time to stop Bailey is now. She would recall later that the exclusion of mill workers in evacuation plans gained the attention of the unions, which added muscle to the fight. She said, quote, they only counted the residential areas. What about the steel mills? There are about 5,000 people there at any given time. When the steel workers realized they were being ignored, I think that's when things really turned around. In 1981, 11 years after NIPSCO revealed the project, they pulled the plug on Bailey 1. The Times of Munster reported, the anti-nuclear groups dragged Nuclear Regulatory Commission proceedings to a point where it was no longer feasible to build the plant. Charlotte reflected on the victory. When you put 10 years of your life into trying to fight something like this, you find it hard to believe that they finally done the right thing. I congratulate them for having the wisdom to make a hard and important choice. She recalled the reason for opposition the next year. It wasn't because we were anti-nuclear, but a reactor located 800 feet from the boundary of a national park and has been damaging to park resources. She told the reporter, the idea of preserving the dunes predates World War I. A proposal to designate a national park was made in 1916, but it failed largely because of Much of what is now the lakeshore was private land, and in those days, public funds were not used to buy private land for a national park. It was an uphill fight all the way. It probably always will be. Charlotte would tell the Northwest Indiana Times that the successful effort to block the plans for a nuclear plant was the highlight of her Save the Dunes career. The Paul H. Douglas Center for Environmental Education was authorized in the park's 1980 expansion bill. Around this time, Charlotte and Herb moved into the home that Herb had built for his parents after they passed away. By 1983, proposed plans were released for the Douglas Center, but Charlotte was concerned that conventional construction would destroy the land's beautiful rolling beaches and dunes. She urged the federal subcommittee overseeing the project to approve additional funding so that the center could be built, quote, as a series of pods that will be placed on top of the dunes, grouped for different activities. Charlotte said at that time, since the plans are not yet final, the council will keep a watchful eye so that the facilities serve their intended purposes and are compatible with the area. Charlotte worked with Representative Katie Hall, who submitted her first bill that year that successfully increased the funding for the Education Center to allow for the special construction to preserve the nature of the site. Representative Hall was Indiana's first African-American woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Later that year, she successfully led legislation that established Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a national holiday. If you visited the center or visit today, you'll experience those pods that Charlotte had envisioned. I remember when I was working while I was there and they were changing the HVAC system, that contractors were just really baffled with the building's whole construction plan and assemblage. And I just wish I'd known at the time that it was all, for a specific purpose. They were just so confused that it was all these pods. And then now it makes a lot more sense. Charlotte was a founding member of the Hoosier Environmental Council in 1983. She explained that the watchdog group organized because, quote, we really wanted to have a presence in Indianapolis to see that the good federal laws we have to protect the environment are actually carried out on the state level. She continued, I think that the work I do is just an example of democracy at work. Citizens have a responsibility to see what they expect from their government actually turns out. The impetus for these laws doesn't come from the top down, unfortunately, but from the bottom up. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the increasing complexity of society, so keeping the government on track is an important and very challenging job. Mary Kay Rothert, who was on the Hoosier Environmental Council with Charlotte, recalled Charlotte's role as a moderator. Quote, she would sit there and always be practical. People would say, oh yes, we'll do X, Y, and Z. Charlotte was the one who would say, look, let's keep it realistic. She would ask questions that would make you realize that you were sort of over the cliff in terms of what you were imagining. In 1984, Charlotte summed up her years spent fighting to protect the region. Quote, they call us bunny lovers, tree huggers, and little old ladies in tennis shoes. But I take that as a backhanded compliment because I know we are respected for what we've done. After Charlotte and Save the Dunes Council helped pass the 1986 expansion bill, she wrote an open letter to the Times of Munster. She said, welcome to Northwest Indiana, an environmental stronghold. Don't laugh. Just because you still see a smoke-filled horizon doesn't mean things are getting worse. In fact, I think things are starting to get better. As a longtime practicing environmental activist, I see growing awareness of our area's environmental problems and more people wanting to correct them. I also see a widespread appreciation of the good things that Northwest Indiana has to offer. Times are changing. Citizens are refusing to allow Northwest Indiana's environment to deteriorate. It's a big job, but it's not an impossible one. If you care and want to help, it'll make the job easier. The environment we are protecting is the only one we have. In 1988, the fight to save a tract that was about 35 acres and known as Crescent Dune was beginning to evolve. Excuse me. Proposals for a marina at the site began to circulate. The area is east of Mount Baldy. It's practically the farthest east portion of the park. Charlotte Reed said that environmentalists would rise up as one to fight against a proposed marina for the site. Although the land was owned by NIPSCO, it was within the authorized boundaries of the National Lakeshore from the 1976 expansion bill. But there was also the stipulation that the land had to be acquired within 2 years, and that hadn't happened. In November of 1989, NIPSCO revealed that a condominium development proposal for that site. The following January, fellow Save the Dunes member and environmental activist Irene Herlocker-Meyer said, quote, "I would think that every national park in the country would be up in arms because it affects all national parks." The then Save the Dunes Council president, Tom Saranac, explained, "If Crescent Dune is permitted to slip out of the park, it will set a precedent that will further encourage private interests to chip away at other authorized lands in national park boundaries." Prospects to stop the condominium efforts seemed dismal after Representative Grzalski supported a plan to allow for the construction that simultaneously promised public access to the beach. But in addition to defacing the lakefront, Charlotte feared that the development of the tract would be really threatened due to erosion. She said, "This beach eroded 170 feet in the last 17 or 18 years. It's the most eroding part of Indiana Dunes shoreline." But on March 27, 1990, Representative Grzalski announced a reversal in his position to endorse the condominium plan due to an outpouring by his constituents. He instead arranged that Crescent Dune would be purchased through eminent domain. Charlotte found the news to be a fitting birthday present. She said, "We, of course, think this is the right decision, and we appreciate the congressman reevaluating his position. It must have been a hard thing for anyone to do." 6 years later, negotiations were complete and Congress approved funds to purchase Crescent Dune. So shortly after, you can see here in the picture, these volunteers, including Charlotte and Herb and Pete Grzalski, came to the area to cut the chain link fence that had been separating Mount Baldy from the Crescent Dune property. In 1988, as executive director of Save the Dunes Council, Charlotte went to Washington, D.C. To testify on the topic of acid rain oversight to a subcommittee on energy and power. She spoke of conditions around the dunes. As watchdogs for a very small and very fragile natural resource, we have become early leaders in the fight for clean air in Northwest Indiana, and we find we must continue that role today. Northwest Indiana's 3 counties along the lake, Lake, Porter, and LaPorte, are non-attainment or unclassified as we speak for sulfur dioxide. Lake and Porter counties are also non-attainment for most of the rest of criteria pollutants. This, 18 years after the enactment of the Clean Air Act. The council believes there is no other area in the state of Indiana where the promises of the Clean Air Act have failed so completely as they have there. In 1985, the Indiana Dunes had the unfortunate distinction of experiencing one of the top 10 most acidic rainfall single events with a pH of 3.38. So between 1980 and 1987, the pH of the rainfall within Indiana Dunes ranged from that 3.88 to 4.38. So very, very acidic. Charlotte spoke on some of the effects that it had in the park. She said that studies that the Park Service had done on air pollution damage to vegetation within the Indiana Dunes have found visible damage to sensitive species. In particular, the absence of many forms of lichen, which are vital indicators of pollution. Charlotte continued with examples of acid rain affecting boats with damaged hulls, decks, and railings that were moored just downwind of Michigan City's coal-burning power plant. She also spoke of the damage to the old Lighthouse Museum listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The structure that housed the fearless lighthouse keeper Harriet Colfax was being showered with pollutants and had been for the last 7 years or so. Charlotte believed in finding a solution, though. She continued at the testimony. The council believes that the time has come to enact meaningful acid rain control legislation now. If not now, when? If not us, who? We also believe that utilities should be encouraged, or if need be, mandated to manage their loads based on the least polluting, not necessarily just the least cost units. I think we need a dialogue involving all of us, and I think the time has come that we now take steps to control a problem that is not going to go away. As a lover of my particular national park and of all national parks, I think we cannot afford to wait any longer until all the trees are dead, all our sensitive lakes are acidified, and all of our fish have rolled over and are no longer edible or swimmable or fishable. I think we have to bite the bullet. Later that year, she told a newspaper reporter what she believed to be the only solution to the acid rain problem that was afflicting the country. She said, legislation is needed to show federal commitment to solving the problem. Well, 2 years later, the Clean Air Act would be amended to include a system known as the Acid Rain Program, which aimed to reduce the sulfur dioxide emissions to half of 1980's value. Charlotte was deeply connected to the Dunes region and committed to bettering it. A later article revealed some of Charlotte's character. Tom Saranac, who was hired by Charlotte to work at Save the Dunes in 1989, recalled when a region mayor called her Queen of the Nitpickers because of her attention to detail, her tenacity, and her knowledge of facts and law. In 1993, Charlotte wrote a piece on the need of ecological restoration for a conference in Chicago. She wrote, "Not only should ecological restoration take place, but it must take place. Petitions and pickets may help. Politics are extremely important. The ecological degradation that has been allowed to happen here creates a moral imperative that ecological restoration take place here. We have an area of incredible beauty, incredible pollution, incredible dissatisfaction, and incredible opportunity. In Northwest Indiana, restoration of both the physical and the ambient environment is not only an absolute for ecological health, but it's essential for economic health. Using the analogy of the Grand Calumet River as a beast, to kiss the beast and turn it into a handsome prince, we will need a lot of people willing to pucker up." On March 25th, 1994, Charlotte, along with Barbara Planten, Kay Franklin, and Irene Herlocker-Meyer, gave a program at the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshores Visitor Center that was entitled Women of the Dunes. And so in that program, they discussed Emma Pitcher, Dorothy Buell, Bess Sheehan, and other women. In an interview a month later, Charlotte said, "We're prickly advocates for the dunes. We're not everybody's favorite environmental group because we take a stand. We still have to resave the dunes periodically. The plant species diversity blows your mind. It's not only beautiful, but the floral biodiversity is incredible, especially for the park's size and the neighborhood that it's in." Charlotte understood and appreciated the inherent value in the entire Indiana Dunes landscape. In 2001, she said, "The dunes are more than just a lake. The way the glaciers retreated, you have a botanical melting pot." She told a reporter in 2003, "There are places in the dunes where you can go and think that you're the only person in this wonderful wilderness. Considering how industrialized Northwest Indiana is becoming, that's important." Stephen Higgs' book, Eternal Vigilance, quotes Charlotte's own description of her life as a preservationist. Charlotte said, "You get hooked on the little victories and the little defeats, and then pretty soon you find, at least in our case, that it becomes the central part of your life. There's no finite point when you say, 'It's over, I can rest.' Eternal vigilance is the price of preserving your good idea." Even in their mid-80s, the Reeds attended civic meetings and voiced their opinions to save the dunes. Charlotte was quoted in 2014 saying, "People ask me all the time, aren't the dunes already saved? No, they're not." In summer of 2015, Charlotte spoke of going to the dunes for the first time with Herb. She said, "I loved it and I still do, and I hope we can keep it from being spoiled any more than it is already." That fall, she stressed to a reporter, "I want people to know how much importance the public played. Without public support, it wouldn't have happened." On February 15th, 2019, the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore was officially renamed Indiana Dunes National Park, an achievement that delighted the Reeds. Charlotte passed away 2.5 months later on May 2nd, 2019, at the age of 90. 7 months after that, Herb passed away at age 93. I was lucky enough to meet Charlotte and Herb on my first season of working at the National Lakeshore in 2017. Former Save the Dunes president Tom Saranac said of Charlotte after her death, "She left a mark on clean air and clean water and clean land on Indiana. She was always upbeat and positive. She'd say we'd figure it out and take care of it. But she made sure you'd done extensive homework and that you were able to back up your facts." The vice president of Porter County's chapter Isaac Walton League, Jim Sweeney, spoke of Charlotte after her passing. "She did her homework. She was not willing to go out on a limb unless she knew she was right. Then she was fierce. I have always wanted to have Herb's scrappiness and Charlotte's intellect and grace." She was so committed. There was no schedule when it came to the issues. It was more than a job to her. As we saw the Shifting Sands this is the same quote. As we saw Shifting Sands, which is the documentary on saving the dunes, she loved to acknowledge and brag on the impact that women had and the efforts to protect the dunes. Talking about what they could do with more money and members, Charlotte looked right at me and said, "You need to get more women." Jeanette Niegu said that, quote, "Both she and Herb and Dorothy Buell and all the Dunes people made an impression on me. They taught me that even if it seemed pie in the sky, if you work hard and organize, you can achieve." Jeanette went on to be a distinguished activist in her own right, leading both Save the Dunes and the League of Women Voters. Former Save the Dunes executive director Susan Mahalo said, "Charlotte's work inspired us and reminds us we are all a part of nature." She believed we needed to be informed and participate in public commentary. That was very important to Charlotte. We have to honor her by making sure we show up, make sure our voices are heard. We have to honor her by realizing the dunes are never completely really saved. Mahalo continued in another interview, "She's one of the most principled people I ever met, and one of the things she taught me is when you're taking a position on something, take an informed one." As a result, she gained a lot of credibility. How things were held in public trust was very important to her. She never wanted to see that compromised. Gary Brown, the president of Porter County's Isaac Walton chapter, said of Charlotte that she never held back from truth or duty. Honest virtue was her vision. Intelligence and courage were her weapons. Perseverance and faithfulness were her victory. Herb and Charlotte Reed's home near the Glenwood Dunes area still stands today within Indiana Dunes National Park. In fact, the Reeds and their supporters were able to get it successfully added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2011. It was eligible because of its significance in the efforts of citizen conservation groups to preserve the Indiana Dunes. And at the time of designation, Herb and Charlotte hoped in the future that the house would be used for environmental education, as a museum or an interpretive center to tell the story of citizen movement to preserve the dunes. Herb told a reporter, quote, "The idea we were thinking about was it could be used as a display area to tell the story of saving the dunes over 100 years, the history of saving the dunes and the park and the people who did it." I personally think that this is an awesome idea and what a perfect spot to be able to share that story. Charlotte's work lives on through the knowledge that she laid down for us to follow. She was a teacher and a mentor to so many. Her passion is an inspiration. I hope that you think of these stories maybe the next time you visit the Douglas Center or you're just walking down the trail, getting a nice fresh of breath air. In Shirley Heinz's 1984 publication, The Indiana Dunes Story, Charlotte wrote, "It is impossible to predict what the major threats will be in the future. It is possible, however, to predict that the park will survive only if it has public support." So happy to have been able to share with you all tonight. I hope I was able to provide a little bit of a taste of what's to come and maybe some inspiration for the future. I've learned so much on my research journey, and I want to challenge you guys to question what you know or what you think you know. And I want to challenge you to dig deeper so that we can all bring more whole truths to the stories that we share. We have time for questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm over here, a hot mess, all teary-eyed.
Yeah, and
That was
if anyone would even just want to share about a Wonder Woman of the Dunes on or off my list, this is a perfect opportunity.
Thank you so much, Joe. I know there are a few people who need to get going, so we'll do our prize wheel real fast, and then we can open it up a little bit. So
okay.
I'm gonna share real fast here. And Joe, tell us about our prizes here.
All right. Well, we've got Diane of the Dunes, The True Story of Alice Gray by Janet Zinke Edwards.
All right, let's see. And our lucky winner. Bonnie. Is Bonnie here? Bonnie. Pretty sure Bonnie, I talked with Bonnie and she was gonna be coming later. No, Bonnie, sorry, Bonnie. All right, let's spin again. Here we go. For Diane of the Dunes. Dan
Bearball's here.
Dan, you win. Send me a message with your address, please. Great. All right. What's up next, Joe?
We have Mae Watts's book, Reading the Landscape of America. Mae Watts is another Wonder Woman of the Dunes. She was the student of Henry Cole.
Sorry, it got real loud there. Karen.
I can see a Karen on the screen.
All right, Karen.
All right.
You win.
All right. Up next, we have Kay Franklin and Norma Schaefer's book, Duel for the Dunes.
Okay. All right. Sorry, Karen was the second book. I'm trying to write these down, make sure we get the right books to the right people. Mary Nell. Mary, are you still here? I saw her earlier.
I don't see in the list.
No. She may have cut out early. All right, sorry, we're gonna spin again. So much spinning. At least it's a happy song, right? David's still here. I know, I saw him earlier too.
David Phelps is still on the screen.
All right, David Phelps, you win. Great.
All right.
All right, that's good. Well, I think we'll cut it there.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, so if any comments or questions, raise your hand or put something in the chat. We got a couple of great comments about what an excellent presentation. So well done.
Thank you. Holy cow. Yeah, there are a lot of comments here.
Questions?
Thanks to Kim for joining us tonight from
Yeah, hi Kim.
Hi guys. Yeah, this is so wonderful to see this tonight. How cool. Awesome job, Joe.
Thank you
I've
very much.
learned so much about all the new folks that
Yeah.
you've added to the list, Drusilla Carr and yeah, everything. It's really excellent.
Got another comment, a side note that the Reed House is cool because of how it incorporates elements of nature into its design.
Ooh, yeah.
It's a cool thing.
Yeah, the house is occasionally toured for the Logs to Lustrum tour. So that might be an opportunity to see it.
Nice. Great.
Right.
Man.
Well, I guess that concludes our night then. Thank you so much, Joe, for all the wonderful research that you've done. Thank you, Kim, for helping to keep this project going and supporting
it's so
this.
Nice to be able to see it to continue and just the next steps. Yeah, an exciting future, I think, for the badass women, Wonder Women of the Dunes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll keep it going.
Excited to see where it goes from here. So thank you.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And before everyone signs off, really fast, we do have a couple of upcoming programs, including our first in-person adult workshop in a very long time. I don't have my screen up, but next month, April 19th, is Regional Frogs. So the curator of herpetology, here we go. Thank you,
I'm getting
Erin.
there.
Curator of herpetology from the Peggy Nodebart Nature Museum. She will join us virtually to do regional frogs. And then May 7th is forest bathing in person. So that is our first in-person workshop in a very long time, and it is limited to only 15 people. So if you are interested, please sign up. Sign up soon. We've already sold a bunch. And then here's the other exciting thing. I was looking at things today, and my brother-in-law sent me this thing saying that it's possibly we could see the Northern Lights tonight. So I mean, it's raining, so we probably can't.
Always, every
single time. But I mean, obviously that is not the Northern Lights from Indiana, but I just love the Northern Lights, and so wanted to put that out there. So go outside, enjoy our Indiana dunes, and who knows, maybe you will see the Northern Lights. So there you go.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Have a wonderful
Thank
evening.
you, everyone.
Bye.
You guys.
Thank
Thanks.
you.